on violence against women and children. On behalf of our team, I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar today, Technology and Violence Against Women and Other Marginalized Groups. Our center is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehoik, and the Attawandaron peoples. Please think about the traditional lands you are currently situated on and join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. The ongoing work to make the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular, to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country, should inform our discussions in this webinar and beyond. Today's presentation will be 40 to 45 minutes long, followed by 20 minutes for questions and answers. Please type questions, comments for our speaker in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Towards the end, my colleague Diane Lalonde and I will present your questions to our speaker. Earlier today, a link to the presentation slides was emailed to you, and that link is now in the chat box. Thanks to our presenter, Nasreen, the webinar will be recorded and available on our website within the next few days. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Nasreen Rajani is a doctoral candidate at Carleton University, where her dissertation examines the experiences of racialized and Indigenous women creating their own digital tools and online campaigns to end violence against women in Canada. Nasreen is also an active board director and the communications chair for the Women's Initiatives for Safer Environments, WISE, in Ottawa. Nasreen, thank you for joining us, and please, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. My mic is okay?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. So thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to all organizers involved, Linda, Diane, and especially Sarah, for all of your technical and logistical help for connecting all of us here today. And thank you to all of you too who are joining us from wherever you are this afternoon. I'm Nasreen. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm joining you today from where I work and study as a settler on the unceded and never surrendered land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. To further ground this land acknowledgement of mine in the work of ending violence against women, I urge all of us here today to specifically reflect on how you are working in solidarity with Indigenous communities towards land-back defense activism and towards the recommendations outlined in the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, Girls, Transgender, and Two-Spirit People. All right, so this is the agenda that I have for you today. Oh, Sarah, looks like my slide didn't, oh, there it is. There we go. So this is the agenda I have planned for us this afternoon. I'm going to first introduce you to some of my dissertation research. We're going to spend a bit of time going in depth on intersectionality and technology that are guiding my research questions, the implications, and some of the key takeaways that I have to share with all of you today. So as Linda shared, I'm finishing up my PhD at Carleton in Communications and Media Studies. I received my MA in Women's and Gender Studies, where I started to really immerse myself in feminist intersectional theories and research. But I'm by no means an expert. I'm always learning, but I do spend a lot of my time reading and thinking about our relationships with technologies and challenging systems of oppression. So I hope that I can share some of that knowledge with you today. I also recognize that most of you joining in are not academics. I've purposely made this presentation for such a wide audience, so I'm going to try my very best not to be using really big academic concepts and language, but I'd really just want to introduce this topic to a much wider audience outside of the university. And I couldn't have asked for a better network to share this with. I won't spend too much time speaking specifically to instances of gender-based violence. Luckily, the previous webinar that this team did with Monica Samuel on gender-based violence and intersectionality goes through that. It's fantastic. Please make sure that you check that one out too, if you haven't already. And then finally, I want to take a minute to just kind of clarify the scope of what I'll be focusing on. In this project, I use the term violence against women, not as interchangeable with gender-based violence, but as one aspect of gender-based violence. So gender-based violence does not solely affect women, but my project is focused on the disproportionate amount of violence against all those who self-identify as women, acknowledging that violence against men and those outside of the traditional gender binary also take place. All right, so my dissertation project came out of a bit of a growing frustration I was feeling as an increase in uptake in both media and academic attention of kind of like so-called hashtag activism, especially around issues of ending violence against women. So of course, many of you may be familiar with the hashtag #MeToo movement. And some of you will also remember that even before that, in Canada, we were going through our own kind of version of Me Too following the Jian Ghomeshi trial and with the hashtag "Been Raped, Never Reported." And yes, for sure, there are some positives around raising awareness of violence against women, potentially transforming policies, which some of these hashtags have demonstrated. But the voices and experiences that I kept hearing about were those primarily of white women over and over and over again. When I did hear stories and the experiences of any racialized, indigenous, trans, queer women from any news outlets or even from the academic research, it's almost always about the online violence that they face or the threat of such violence. So on one hand, we have these hashtags that are great for ending violence against women. But on the other hand, like violence against women is prevalent online. So don't be online. So these kinds of major kind of discourses that are being presented to us is not really helpful in explaining or understanding how, for women, how women are using these online spaces to end violence against women. Right. To kind of further illustrate the erasure of certain women from online spaces that I was witnessing, I'll use this example of Black Lives Matter. Many of you are probably well aware by now that Black Lives Matter movement. Some of you may know and remember that the hashtag Black Lives Matter was created in 2013 in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, and has since symbolized a movement in a world where Black lives are systematically disadvantaged. But this is a quote from one of the Black Lives Matter's founders, Alicia Garza, in response to the continued theft and erasure of Black queer women's activism. She writes, quote, "Black Lives Matter is a unique contribution that goes beyond extrajudicial killings of Black people by police and vigilantes. Black Lives Matter affirms the lives of Black queer and trans folks, disabled folks, Black undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. It centers those that have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. It is a tactic to rebuild the Black liberation movement." So how often are you reminded of this narrative when it comes to hearing about Black Lives Matter and the issues around Black Lives Matter? Where is this narrative in our media coverage and even in some of the scholarly work that is pushed out? How often are you still hearing about George Floyd's murder, but no longer Breonna Taylor's? Or if you're in Ontario, Regis Korchinski-Packett's fatal encounter with the Toronto police? So there's obviously still so much missing about what's happening in online spaces for women and with women. And through my studies, during my MA, during my PhD, I knew I had to start with how I was thinking about technologies and what role intersectionality can play in helping me out as a researcher interested in examining these mediated spaces. Oopsies. All right. So when it comes to thinking about technology, there's when we look back at a lot of that research and the media attention around some of those hashtags, so hashtag been raped, never reported, even hashtag MMIW, used for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, they focused on looking directly at causes and effects. So for instance, hashtags are great for online activism. Hashtags are great for changing, the public conversation. It's great for targets survivors to be sharing their stories in solidarity with one another. And there's also that then other side of cause and effect, right? So hashtags do nothing to create any transformational change. They do nothing to lead to any actual kind of policy changes. So we have these two sides of that kind of same coin. But with this very kind of common approach to considering the impacts of technology, we forget about how social technology really is. And what I mean by that is not that technology is on Facebook with a bunch of friends. I mean that the technologies don't exist in a vacuum. Rather, there are significant social actors throughout its creation, its design, up until all the way through its use of the technology. So technologies are created by people to use it, and people are not neutral. People are not as objective as we like to think. We have our own biases and values of the world that end up seeping into the technological designs, production, and use. The problem is that we are in a culture where we have the same people creating our most used and profitable online spaces. So I think about what's kind of at stake here. And I think that some of the founders and creators and designers of a lot of the technologies that we most often use are constantly making decisions, consciously and unconsciously, about which groups are privileged and which are not. You can see this when we question who's being imagined as the default user, imagined by the creator, the designer, the marketers. The list of technologies that have failed, those who deviate from what has been now programmed as the norm, which is typically a white, cisgendered, male, English-speaking, middle to upper class, it's quite immense. So just an example to share with you, and this isn't a new case. This has changed after years of individuals calling on Facebook to make this change. But when I had first set up my Facebook profile, like many eons ago, I never checked one of the gender boxes. So they asked gender, and I just put other or didn't answer. I don't remember what the options were, but I didn't answer it. I was still able to have a profile and do everything I can. But what I started to notice was that on Facebook's end, the platform needed to somehow report to advertisers who they like, the advertisers that they're selling my personal data to, but they also need this information of my pronouns to when I'm interacting with friends. But to my surprise, I was consistently referred to with a he and him pronoun, even though again I didn't check anything. So for instance, I would post something on a friend's wall. Their notification would be like, Nasreen has posted right on his wall. So throughout this glitch, we can see that Facebook's default user is a man. And when I didn't have a profile picture, this was actually the picture that Facebook uses. I don't believe this is the same anymore, but this is what it was when back in the day. This may, of course, seem like a small glitch in the system that is easily remedied, of course, but it's the same logic creating and designing the technology that we most often use that has potentially fatal consequences. Oh, yeah, all right. So here are just like very few of some recent headlines that I found in terms of how technologies that are being designed are having potentially fatal consequences on particular people. So I'm going to read through these headlines just in case this isn't accessible to everyone. So for instance, self-driving cars could be more likely to run over Black people. Apple's sexist credit card investigated by the US regulator. Apparent racial bias found in Twitter photo algorithm. Amazon's facial recognition misidentified Boston athletes as criminals. Location-based policing, new technologies, same racisms. And then in the bottom there, that is part of the UN campaign that was addressing how Google's search engine was kind of auto-filling in the content of words related to either women or racialized women, specifically around like Black women, and it would autocorrect using really discriminating like what do you call, like, examples. So this is just a small list of those headlines having such consequences. We all need to acknowledge the immense power yielded in deciding and who gets to decide who participates online and making decisions in that design process. And I think this is where intersectionality comes in to kind of help us out with this. So an intersectional lens or approach towards discrimination is an understanding of interlocking systems of oppression. So intersectionality, it's a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw 30 years ago. And she constructed this term that was grounded in the Black women's erasure and discrimination in US civil rights law. But it's important to note that this is a concept that has been written about by Black, Asian, and Latina writers and activists long before, that they weren't using a specific word, but they were talking about this idea of how to explain race and gender, the ways that they intersect, producing barriers for racialized women that are not experienced by either white women or racialized men. So it's an approach or lens to create knowledge that is now used in the analysis of the lived experiences of racialized, disabled, Indigenous, trans women, where all identities are seen as intersectional. But some identities are systematically privileged while disadvantaging others. So an intersectional approach is useful here because it plays a key role in understanding the barriers that diverse women face and challenging those systems that maintain and reproduce those discriminations. So I find it's easy to get trapped sometimes into talking about people's identities, people's individual social classifications, but this isn't very helpful for us. We need to remember that we're talking about systems of oppression, such as white supremacy, how they're inseparable from patriarchy, colonialism. So I really like this visual specific to white supremacy. Of course, I find it helpful for myself in how I can shift my thinking to remind myself that I'm thinking about the systems of power. And it's this quote I took is from a section of a spoken word poem. And I love it so much. It says, white supremacy is not the shark, it's the water. And I think we can use this kind of similarly when we're thinking through different power relations and structures, such as heteropatriarchy, ableism, where here the shark isn't the symbol of patriarchy. Maybe we're thinking the shark is, like that representing that guy in the office who's like sexually assaulting women colleagues. Like, of course, that's a problem, but the actual problem we need to address is the one in which we have a system that constructs and maintains those relations that keep that behavior and those values of the shark acceptable, tolerable, and unquestioned. So in other words, I guess getting rid of a few bad apples or bringing in some diversity doesn't fix the problem of discrimination, right? These are temporary band-aids of representation. So we need to focus on those larger structures that maintain and reproduce these power relations that we see more than happening at the individual level. Not only that, with intersectionality, I think it's really important to move beyond a single axis of analysis. And in this case of media attention and scholarly research that's been emerging on ending violence against women has been really stuck on focusing only on oppressions of patriarchy or oppressions of white supremacy, as if these two are easily separable. Further, any conclusions made through media and scholarship that don't see beyond a single axis of oppression, so don't think beyond gender or beyond race, risks creating even more harm to historically and continually excluded communities. One way that I've kind of been reading a lot and learning a lot on how to do this is really about centering the experiences and perspectives of those who fall in intersections of different and overlapping power structures and advancing their needs towards what equality and transformation would look like for them. So in this case, examining gender is really only a starting point. And to use this example, well, this this visual, I'm not a graphic designer, so I'm sorry about this slide, but I use this image to just convey how we can't continue to try to separate the ways in which these power relations impact us. When I'm in an organization, and this is something I see often in so many places, and you probably do as well. Places that set up spaces to accommodate diversity. There's women's spaces, and then there's spaces for racialized people, spaces for queer people, but for me, for so many other people who are impacted not only by heteropatriarchy, also white supremacy, also colonialism, ableism, how do we choose then which service or program or dedicated space would be best for our experience? For instance, I can't, for instance, remove my skin and only be a woman, leaving all my experiences of racism behind, thereby, being fully served by some sort of universal women's space. But similarly, spaces for racialized folk often are still heavily dominated by men because, patriarchy. So my concerns then as a woman aren't taken as seriously. It's these interlocking oppressions we face, they can't be served with a single access analysis because people's lives aren't single access. So before moving forward with more about my project details, I just want to take a step back and just remind us, I just threw a lot of information at you. So I just want to make sure that we remember a couple of key things moving into kind of how I use this to think through my dissertation project. So technologies are social because of the social actors involved in its creation, production, and its ultimate use. The role of people is important in considering, excuse me, how technologies are being used, the impacts on our relations, our use, and even resistance of the machine that are often not considered. And then intersectionality as an approach or lens to examine how technologies are failing some users over other users as we turn our attention to the systemic power relations that maintain and reproduce particular discriminations. I couldn't think of a better slide than just having some books here. So you'll have to bear with me a little bit. But so overall, my project, I interviewed 9 self-identified racialized and Indigenous women activists in Canada who were creating online tools, online campaigns to end violence against women. I focused on those with experiences of creating their own tools or online spaces rather than those who just participated in online activism, because it demonstrated more of an active commitment of using such technologies rather than like a passing participation. And even though this project focused primarily on women who were racialized and Indigenous, many of those that I spoke to were also disabled, queer, and they varied from ages from 20 to their late 40s. I'm not going to be specifying any cases that were used in my project or that were spoken about to protect the identity of all those involved, because this is such a small community. And if you're part of this community, you know how small it is. But I want to give you just that bit of a picture of who these women were. And of course, this is not meant to be representative, as each person's experience was so unique, but the patterns that were identified as part of their relationships with technology revealed some interesting findings that I think gives us some insights into how we can continue thinking about technologies around ending violence against women. Ultimately, I examined how the unequal distribution of their online experiences might be structured by their position within intersecting fields of race, class, gender, and disability. So centering the experiences and perspectives of these 9 women started to fill in the gaps that I've, kind of been alluding to throughout this presentation. My interviews with these amazing women showed that their online activism was really a lot more complicated than the picture that's been painted for us so far through the use of other nationwide hashtags that are used by high-profile celebrities, politicians, journalists. Racialized Indigenous women are in various online spaces, creating all sorts of online tools, mobile apps, podcasts, websites, games, and online campaigns, maybe I just said that, to end violence against women, that go on beyond the Twitter hashtag. And they've always been there online. They're just not as visible. Only some are. And it's these online tools and spaces that they take up space in that both facilitate and reproduce some of the inequalities that they've experienced themselves offline. So technologies reproduce a lot of our intersecting powers and oppressions of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, settler colonialism, as I've been going over. And this was observed through how these interviews' relationships with technologies were so complex and unique. But some of them were able to kind of resist and rework the system to fit their needs. But this was more likely by those who were closer to kind of that imagined default user. So with the skills they had, the knowledge they had, the networks they had, those who were more similar to that imagined default user were better able to take up those skills, be online, and create greater networks for themselves. So this wasn't a case where as long as you have access to the internet and a social media account, like, hurrah, you're an activist and you're being successful with your campaigns. There's this other level of their experience with technology that really has an impact on how their online activism is viewed, is spread, is represented. And social media platforms, campaigns, podcasts, mobile apps, websites, we've known that none of these were designed with activists in mind. But more specifically, these were never designed with racialized, Indigenous, disabled women in mind, which of course has so many implications for so many other users. For instance, we can't entangle how multiple expressions of power relations interact when we see this evidence. When on Twitter, ground zero for hashtag activism actually becomes more profitable when there are instances of anonymous trolling mobs targeting specific users on platform. So violence on Twitter that happens that way makes Twitter a lot of money, right? So what incentivizes them to change? What incentivizes them to consider an intersectional perspective as they're designing these tools? Most recently, I think maybe I'm on this next slide. Sorry about that. So this one, I'll use this as an example. I was just reading about it this weekend, but Twitter had, as this would be an example of how those inequalities are reproduced and reinforced through these technologies, and how a lot of companies, especially Twitter, are just so far removed from thinking about an imagined user besides anyone than who they've always imagined their user. So Twitter just announced the launch of Fleets. Maybe some of you have heard about this, which, similar to Snapchat and Instagram stories, are posts that disappear within 24 hours. And of course, there has been an expression of outrage from those within the anti-violence sector, and for very good reason, because from our work and our experience in using technologies like this, they'll only amplify the experiences of online violence that the most marginalized already face, and those who have less access to resources, to supports. I have, and also, which I heard this, like, calling it fleets, like, that's like a slang term used by the queer community that has like a very different meaning. So there's a lot, obviously, like, huge companies are not even thinking, with any kind of intersectional lens, so there's just a lot of problems. And of course, this is a problem that Snapchat and Instagram have already been facing, but the fact that, how long have anti-violence advocates been saying this about the impact on violence against women, and yet now we have a brand new one, thanks Twitter. So that was just an example. One thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about as well from my findings, and what happens when you kind of take a more of an intersectional approach, you find out that technologically facilitated violence is a lot more than just the anonymous trolling mobs of white men that we hear about. Of course, that happened. It didn't happen to everyone that I interviewed, and some of them that experience that kind of anonymous trolling, mob attacks that we hear about in the media a lot, their ability to kind of fight back was very much dependent on their networks of support. So people who already had really huge networks of support were much able and more confidently able to kind of deal with these on their own. But this wasn't the only type of violence that they were experiencing online through their online activism work. Um, Not only was a lot of their violence not just gender specific, it was racist, it was transphobic, it was homophobic, all of these things that they were receiving from people. It wasn't also just anonymous. They're receiving a lot of violence from other white feminists, anti-violence feminists in the community, even not in the anti-violence community, just people who identify themselves as white feminists, but also trans exclusionary feminists. But these are all people who are identifiable online. They're not anonymous. They have their real names attached to their profiles. Some of these people who are committing these violence are, kind of big users on social media themselves. So that I think is interesting when we start to think about how we approach any kind of policies in terms of improving the ways in which women are facing such online violence. And if we're only looking at the experiences of one type of woman and only getting the sense of the anonymous trolling men, and we come up with policies for that, well, what types of violence is being left out? Who does not have supports and networks because that type of violence is not being seen as an important part of violence? So these are other aspects of violence that are coming out, that are happening online, that we really need to explore more of and understand, so that we can put an end to it, stop it. I'm not really sure. Lots of things to consider. So I think about what's at stake here when we don't start accounting for intersectionality with technology. And I do see a lot of harm continuing to marginalized communities, not only with the examples that I've already provided throughout, but I think it's important that technologies aren't inherently awful for those who have been historically and continue to be excluded and discriminated against. And it's also not inherently liberating for anyone. Perhaps, people have a variety of experiences with technology. However, technologies favor a particular user. Many of the same inequalities expressed in the offline world are replicated online, embedded through the design and the decisions made by a certain type of creator. So, as I kind of said before, which groups have the most or the least access to support or resources when when a focus on that single access is privileged over intersectionality? And I think with any kind of policies, regulations from online media, social media companies, and even our state legislation, focusing on that single access really does leave out a lot of the violence that is experienced by women. If racialized, Indigenous, queer, trans, disabled women's experiences are ignored, then the supports won't exist. These groups more likely then to be pushed offline, which has even more real impacts now as we depend more and more being online for our everyday needs. And if we center these perspectives and advancing their needs, maybe we'll see more experiences of violence beyond gender that are simultaneously racist, ableist, and transphobic. So in this case, we're better equipped then to understand the failure of a process of reporting violence that relies, for instance, on interactions with law enforcement as the only immediate response, when racialized Indigenous women have a history of violent encounters with law enforcement. So how can you have a policy where the first line of help is going to the police, as just an example? So my goal My goal for today was to highlight the importance of thinking through technologies for ending violence against women with intersectionality. Before I turn to any questions and comments you may have, I want to leave you with some key takeaways I hope will be helpful. The first, I think, would be to always be working towards decentering that single axis analysis of power rangers, power relations, and challenge the status quo in your own analysis and examination of technologies and ending violence against women. Who is being imagined as the user? What are the implications for those whose identities are marginalized intersectionally? There is usually no single universal design to account for all people, and that's okay. I think we need to stop looking for one design type that will account for people because people are so different. Instead, maybe we need to start thinking of multiple configurations. And even I'd say we need to start moving away from trying to constantly fix and repair these designs that were never built with so many of us in mind, and move away to rebuilding or reworlding, creating our own tools and worlds from the beginning, being in control throughout its development and use with the intention to break down intersecting powers of domination, which of course these tools that are made that we're primarily using were not made to do. So we need to start with different tools. We need to start with different methods. And if you're interested more in this kind of design aspect, there's a wonderful new book out called Design Justice that explores this and does a really fabulous job of talking about how we can make our technologies just better for everyone. And so I think it's important, thinking, what do we want to keep when we're thinking about new technologies from our histories? What do we want to leave behind and what do we want to change? I think taking intersectionality to other aspects, not just technology, is also important. So how can intersectionality better inform what you're working on in regards to ending violence against women? I've tried really hard to simplify this presentation as an introduction to intersectionality and technology, using my research to help kind of ground this thought experiment, but it's definitely much more complicated, as my 200 plus dissertation will illustrate. But I'm very happy to continue chatting and answering questions if anything, still wasn't making any sense, or if I could clarify anything. But thank you so much. I look forward to hearing about how you're thinking about intersectionality and technology in your work in ending violence against women. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nasreen. So much to think about in that presentation, and definitely people have comments and questions.
Perfect.
And I think we want to start with something that's fundamental and came in very early and came out as you went on to explain things, I think. But just in case, can you spend a couple minutes defining what you mean by online violence?
Oh, yeah. So I take a very broad approach to online violence. So any violent, so yeah, this is a tough one. So anything that happens online where where the target is understands it to be violence. This is what I would say island violence. So that's why my research is very interview based. It's very like, how are you defining online violence? And I think that's when I started to get really interesting perspectives in terms of where the literature really tries to differentiate and specify like that gendered online violence, but how they were talking about violence was, they're talking all about ending violence against women, but would talk about, racist trolls, but it wouldn't be specific to attacking their gender. But again, you can't separate that. So I really, I didn't go in with my own idea of violence, but from their understandings of what online violence is, it's very much what they experience. Maybe someone else wouldn't consider violence, but for them, that is an aspect of violence that they are concerned for their safety, the safety of their loved ones. So more than just kind of, I guess, I don't want to use that term like bullying or anything, but it's a sense of violence that they would fear for themselves, their lives, or the lives of their loved ones.
So would you include in that, Nasreen, if they felt intimidated and or fearful? in the way that
Absolutely.
you described.
Mhm.
Okay.
And even like ongoing instances. So whereas like ongoing and consistent harassment, maybe looking at it at such a individual case may not, like that incidence level may not be violence per se, but it's that consistency where that person is feeling like this is ongoing, like I am now in a state of this is not okay anymore. This is a state of I am afraid now.
It's a good point. Not did that, but has to look at the pattern, the context of what is going on in the pattern.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Another question that came in is, what are your thoughts on people who use, quote, freedom of speech arguments and that the online world should not be censored and regulated?
Um, that's a tough one. Yeah, for sure. I personally, my kind of view is that these spaces should be free spaces, free speech spaces, so that you're not causing harm to anyone. So as long as like that harm isn't being done, um, you know, yeah. Can you repeat that last part of that question again so I can make sure I
Yeah.
address that?
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on those who use freedom of speech as an argument and say that the online world should not be censored or
Not be
regulated?
censored. Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. And I think what happens when we don't have censorship and regulation is, I mean, what you see on 4chan, what you see on 8chan, what you see on like Reddit, maybe back in the day. And so I would say, like, I think there are consequences to both, and maybe both aren't the best options, but we need to be working maybe somewhere in the middle. But I don't think either, they've shown that neither are really working. So, and I think that kind of goes back to the ability of like of fixing something that was never meant to be used in that way in the first place versus building something with the actual purpose, intent, and design to be a space where, maybe maybe it doesn't need like actual like regulations or censorship, but something else that can help create a space where those kinds of values are there, and the people who are there share those values. And of course, this is like in a very idealistic world. But yeah, I think that kind of plays a part in that as well.
That's a perfect lead in to another question that has come in. You've highlighted very effectively the degree to which different online platforms are exclusionary. And one of our participants wonders if you could be more specific in describing how some of the women you interviewed were creating inclusionary and intersectional online tools and spaces. Yeah. So we know what we don't want, and help us flesh out and bring to life a little more what we do want. What does that look like?
So again, without going into too much detail, but to give you something, yeah, definitely. So some of these, the spaces and the tools that they've created, first of all, are not really, it's not usually just one person. So it's usually a team involved, or a couple of people involved. But one of the big things I found is what's important for them is that the content is very intersectional. And it doesn't matter if that content is primarily visual or primarily like text-based or audio. The main concern was that the concerns that they wanted to push around violence against women were concerns that are not having the attention that they should be. So violence in Indigenous communities, violence against racialized communities, violence in trans communities. So what makes their spaces kind of intersectional is partly in the content is very intersectional because, and I think these particular activists they have self-identified as like intersectional feminists. So they definitely are all around like, we need to get away from that, like only looking at gender, only looking at race. So I'd say a big part of it is creating content that moves past that. But then that second part is making sure that people can engage with that content. And this is when I start to see those kinds of reinforcing of discrimination in terms of those, when I mentioned those who are more like that imagined user, are more likely to engage people, are more likely to make things, and I'm that imagined user, a lot of users on social media that, succeed on social media have a lot of digital marketing, advertising, skills, because this is how you use these platforms to network and to engage. So it becomes that these activists who have a special skill set that is not something that all activists have. Like, there are activists who are very grassroots, who are not focusing on the online stuff as much. This is just like once in a while, this is just part of it. But for others who are all online, these are like online people who are online like myself, in terms of I'm always glued to the online world. So it's a familiar space. But this is also, these are like also class differences in terms of who is able to continue all that online activism, all the constant engagement online when, if someone has, a full-time job working in the anti-violence sector and is so busy working with the survivors they're dealing with, like, when is the time to engage with this? So there starts to be a difference in terms of who is more able to use some of the tools to engage, where they're all kind of creating different ones. It's just those who are able to better use skills to engage with people. And so we're seeing a lot of then, the kind of like bad thing about that is that there are a lot of things online that have been created, really cool things, cool content, but we're not seeing it because, it's like, how do we find it, and if, so it's stuff like that. So I'd say like the content, it's very pushed by the content and it's driven by the content that needs to be intersectional.
Just before you leave that, you left a hanging. You said it's not promoted. How do we find it? Do you have an answer to that? Is there a way for it? Like,
I have no answer.
You're letting us know, for those of us in the audience who might not, that there's some amazing stuff out there. But you're also telling us, but it doesn't get discovered. It's not found. And do you have a suggestion or solution for how do we make it more accessible, more known?
Yeah, well, I think one thing is putting that onus more on us in terms of not waiting for it to come into our email box, or not waiting for it to come and a friend to share it, but maybe to actively go and look for it, and maybe go past the first page of Google once in a while. And I think some of it is, I think there is an expectation that things are just, we're so bombarded with information now that I think there's an expectation that, okay, it'll come to me if it's important. But I think when it comes, when we're seeing that there's a bit of a divide in terms of what kind of content and what kind of people are able to be more visible, I think that means that we need to do a little bit more work. And I think one of the big things would also be, I talk all about decentering, like, that kind of status quo. So if we think about how we would go looking for this information, well, maybe like, let's not use the regular means that we're looking for this information. Maybe like, let's not use the same networks that give us that same information, but going out of our way to make different networks and to try to find those. And once we get to that one, like, maybe we can find another one. But I do feel like there's a lot of onus that's being placed on these activists, and they are doing this work, they have this knowledge, but I think to some extent, like, we need to start looking for that too, and not just expecting that, okay, if it shows up on my Facebook newsfeed, like, I know about this, and then I won't worry about anything else. But yeah, definitely, I mean, it's tough, and like, we are now in this environment where we kind of expect that, and that's kind of how our information flows. So navigating that with activism is is interesting, especially, like Twitter and Facebook and Reddit are so like anti-spam, right? So as an activist, if you're trying to share, hey, there's a march going on, I'm sending you the poster, I'm sending this to like the 10,000 people in my network, well, Twitter will stop you from doing that because it looks like you're spamming everyone, right? So there's so many like issues in that design that I feel like activists and anyone who wants to continue make things online to raise awareness about ending violence against women, or making their own tools and games, like it's kind of that second step. Like we all, even if we have that access, and I think that's what I'm kind of pushing back on a little bit, is this idea that as long as we have access to a computer, we have some hope. But all of these people not only have access, but incredible skills to be able to making this content. It's just, there's still something in the way. And that is primarily in the design and in the culture of how our online lives are.
Thank you, Nasreen.
So a lot of people obviously expressed upset when you're sharing examples of trolling and experiences of violence and hate online. And some were wondering what they can do to best support an individual if they see this happening online.
Yeah, well, the biggest thing, I think, being an active bystander is really important. When someone's being targeted, especially online, it's, I know, we sometimes, and maybe you're familiar with the messages too, like if this happens to you, like, take a screenshot, save the files, start your report, make sure you're logging everything. This is really, really difficult to do if to like constantly read the things that you're getting to yourself in order to like have that evidence. So that's something that active bystanders can do. Friends, if someone has confided into you, to take on that work of just like collecting evidence for someone else, so that someone else doesn't have to go through that. Because the reporting, when it does happen, the reporting for Twitter and Facebook, as you've probably have heard, either anecdotally or from the media, like they're not good. And a lot of the report, actually, something that came out that has also been confirmed in other kind of media reports and stuff. But what ends up happening is, and this, in the case of one of my participants, it was the trans exclusionary feminists who are they'll keep reporting. Like any kind of posts or anything that are like pro-trans, they'll report it, right? And because Twitter or Facebook will be like, oh, it's been reported as something bad, we will take it down and do an investigation. It ends up happening the reverse way. So reporting is very complex. It's not on the side to help targets at all or survivors. So I'd say if you know someone or have witnessed this, do it, like ask what you can do to help. But I think taking on that kind of labor of, collecting that evidence for them to help them would be very, very helpful. And believing them, of course.
Nazarene, we've seen a lot in the media fairly recently where platforms are really being challenged about the fact that they're allowing online violence to happen. Mm-hmm. And that they are allowing it to occur in their space. And what are your thoughts about how tech companies can or could be holding people accountable? I think it's all, I just think recently there was discussion, and I think momentarily they shut down President Trump's Twitter. And that was quite, I think there's a time when we would never have foreseen that. Not that it maybe we wouldn't have liked to have seen it shut down, but we wouldn't have seen somebody doing that or taking that action, a company. So what are your thoughts about that and your ideas?
Yeah, well, I think it's still very, very slow. And I think, like women especially have been calling on these concerns, for decades, literally decades now, like, I mean, or maybe 1 decade, but, and, only now, like Twitter and Facebook are starting to put together these policies and these like actual strategies to combat things like hate speech, misinformation, fake news, which again is great. But at the same time, like, where was this when we were calling for this, at the beginning? And so I think unfortunately, like, I mean, those kinds of policies will trickle down to help us. But again, I think it just shows that it's not a priority, even though like women is 51% of their population, like, you know, half, we're not a concern in that way. But I've also heard like it's because they rely so much on kind of like algorithms, machine learning to help, you know, so a lot of like the filtering of content and anything that could be mistaken as like fake news, you know, they're trying to do this with machine learning, which, okay, so you don't want a person to go through and read all and look at all this awful stuff, like that's really awful. So let's use machine learning, but then who's training that machine learning, right? How are they able to identify the difference of someone talking about, concerns of rape versus someone threatening rape, like if they're just looking for keywords and stuff, and I know Twitter has recently been really, really strong against people misgendering any trans folk, and like people have been had their accounts lost and stuff. So they've taken that really serious. And I wonder if that's only being taken seriously because it's a bit easier for the machine learning to know what to look for versus like how, and these things are really complicated too, right? So once you start relying on something like machine learning and algorithms, which, are not, they're supposed to make things easier, right? And when you try to bring in a lot of complications, it doesn't quite work, or that there's going to be some unintended consequences. And then who will be the ones who are hurt or excluded and harmed from those decisions?
Does it fit into too, just, you mentioned halfway through your presentation that violence on some platforms increases platform profit,
Yeah.
company profit. So can you talk a little bit about that in terms of it? Because how does it lead to profit first? And
Yeah.
then how does that explain maybe the reluctance to take the action that we would want to see them when there's violence?
So there's a couple things, and forgive me, I'm going to speak off the top of my head, so I don't know the examples, but I do remember reading recently that a lot of the software, a lot of the startup companies involved in surveillance kind of technologies that are coming out that are being used by people to inflict violence against their intimate partner, their significant others, there is a big market for this. And I believe there's just a lot of money in people wanting to surveil themselves and each other without the concerns of how this affects harmful people. So these kinds of texts will constantly be there because right now this seems to be the thing that's like the cool thing without that recognition. That's just like one aspect. And I wish I could remember more of those details. But in terms of like Twitter and even like Reddit, it was, so once you, especially like the trolling mobs, like when you have on Twitter, for instance, a bunch of people, replying to someone, tagging someone, there's a lot of engagement, right? So for Twitter, this normally would look like a lot of like clout for someone, like, oh, I'm getting so many one of my colleagues, she had shared a story where she was celebrated by Twitter for receiving 1,000 engagements, but all of them were death threats. So it's the engagement that they're looking at, like, oh, your Twitter is being really engaged with right now, like here's some advertising credit and stuff, right? So they're really trying to keep you on, to keep those who engage with people on more, because it's people using Twitter. It's like we're moving around, we're using. So it's part of that logic that works, unfortunately, with that kind of mobbing mentality. So it gets stuck like that. So of course, that's not like the only reason why I think Twitter keeps it, but it's definitely, it works in other aspects. Like, so when that's happening and it's not in the kind of a mob and violent situation, then we're all fine with it. Like, yeah, let's all like tag this person, show our support, let's get this going. Like if it was on a more positive thing, we'd all be like, this is Twitter working. But this is still Twitter working. It's just not working in the way that we want it to, or like that many of us don't want it to, so I hope that kind of clarifies a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Another participant was wondering, do you think the consequences are violent, or sorry, do you think the consequences of violence are different virtually versus in real life? Women experience trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder due to the violence they experience, and science shows it affects them neurologically. Is trauma experienced differently to the body when it happens in a virtual setting?
Mm. Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think it's hard to say. I think it would be dependent on the experience, but the violence you experience, like violence isn't just like a physical aspect, right? So I can experience violence, without being hurt physically, and I think that's the same thing. Is that this online violence, first of all, never really stays online, right? And I think it's like even that threat of fear that it could be offline is still part, like that creates that offline violence, right? Because now all of a sudden you're looking behind your shoulder when you're at the grocery store. It doesn't stay online, especially as so much of our personal information is online and connected to us. It's very rare for it to ever just stay online. So the incident itself may be different, but again, violence is again more than just that physical aspect. So I'd say that yeah, maybe I need to just talk about violence instead of like trying to differentiate between online offline. So I guess when I'm talking about it, it starts online. Maybe we can differentiate with like where it began, but I don't think that there are like clear boundaries, just because of how we interact online, and our online worlds are always with us, right? Like we're always kind of like tuned in, right? So we're never really offline or ever really online, I guess.
Thank you.
There's acknowledgement that there's a lot of lack of acknowledgement of gender-based violence supports in terms of the realities of POC women and youth, especially in the realm of technology. And while there's an appreciation for understanding intersectionality, I think the question and the challenge comes into how do you translate it into action or concrete thinking? And you did talk about, certainly in terms of the content, the examples, the material that you have in terms of your site. But are there other things? Help us with the intersectionality as a place to start, and the framework and the way of thinking is so important. But how do we make sure it enters our practice and our remedies, supports?
Yeah. Oh, that's um it's I think we always just have to keep in mind of, who is being centered, and kind of constantly like us kind of trying to it's so hard to kind of still down intersectionality in a few short points, but I think the important aspects are making sure that we're constantly kind of challenging the status quo, from whatever kind of project we're working on, whether it's technology related to ending violence against women, but using intersectionality as like the starting point, but continuing it through, and as a way to examine, okay, who are we talking about here? What are the different power relations that could exist, that could inflict particular discriminations, and like how can we adjust as we go, and perhaps maybe starting with that, and could be something to start with, if that's clear.
Yeah, no, thank you. Diane?
Yeah, there's a few comments come in relating to loving the idea of making these new platforms, but also feeling kind of stuck with the current platforms we have now.
Yeah.
And especially because that's a large way in which some individuals communicate with the audience. And so wondering if there's any best practices they could keep in mind in the moment when using, like, for instance, Twitter or Facebook.
It's so hard. It's such an unfortunate thing. I mean, you're absolutely like that comment is absolutely right. Like we are stuck using these, and and I think that's also part of the problem, is like you can't really tell people oh, just go off of Facebook or get off of Twitter, because a lot of our lives are online, and that's just not an answer anymore. And I think what I like to see, I guess, yeah, in the future is new tools, new designs being made with these in mind. But for now, and maybe this can go back to even Linda, what you had brought up earlier was that maybe it's on us now to like search out and find, not relying so much on the the algorithms suggesting groups, suggesting people, suggesting events for you. I mean, that's always a start, but we're going to be constantly getting into the same networks and circles and our own ideas. But I think a lot of it will be trying to connect with those people who are, you know, always kind of bringing that intersectionality to mind too, right? And then those networks will be vastly different, of course, than our kind of usual network. So I think one part of it could, and it's hard because Twitter and Facebook, of course, we don't know how their algorithms work exactly, and they're also constantly changing. So you know, we could come up with ways today, but tomorrow they could change something in their design, and then we'll have like, so we always have to play catch up, right? And this is also part of the problem. We have so little control as users, and yet we do rely on it so much. So I think a part of it is like what you can do is being mindful of how Twitter and Facebook are not you know, their purpose is to take our personal data and sell it, right? Like their primary purpose is not to, you know, to engage with each other and like, you know, start forming our community. Like that's a great side aspect of it. But maybe if we're more mindful of how that works, and in terms of like how we're finding people, how much we rely on these tools to find different networks, maybe that's something that we can be more mindful of, and trying to find our own networks without that, or you know, relying on maybe not relying on Facebook and social media for everything, right? But you're right, like it's hard, and I think that's why I'm trying to push for either like just better designs for us, because all of us deserve to have such better online tools to do this kind of stuff.
Nasreen, just as our final question, what gives you optimism? Leave us with a hopeful message. Besides the fact that you're doing research and people like you are doing amazing research in this area and sharing the results with us, what gives you hope? What do we have to hang on to here?
Well, I'd say a lot of my personal hope I'm a big reader. I'm like my personal hope comes from, I've taken up reading a lot of speculative fiction, and particular speculative fiction written by Black, Indigenous, like women of color. So that's pretty much what I've been filling my head with these past 6 months. It's been, I mean, I love science fiction regardless, but speculative fiction is a genre of literature in which we can start imagining different worlds, and new worlds that, you know, are actually like anti-colonial, you know, not worlds that we're in. And maybe from there we've had a lot of like designers, tech designers have been, not a lot, but like many tech designers who are concerned with these issues have been finding a lot of inspiration from these aspects. And so that personally, I love reading about different worlds and the possibilities, because I think we can use our imaginations and bring those here. Of course, it's not going to happen overnight, but I'd say that, yes, I just saw in the comments someone put up some Octavia Butler, and she's my absolute favorite. Absolutely, yes, Octavia Butler. Yeah, so that's kind of where my hope is, in speculative fiction written by women of color, and I think there's a lot of hope in there.
Conceiving a different world.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Nasreen, thank you so much, and for your generosity in having two people fire questions at you on the spot. We really appreciate it, and the time you've spent with us today and sharing your wisdom. And we look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all of this.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Don't forget the evaluation. The link is in the chat box. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.